Hi guys, welcome to another exciting video on Java. In the last video we have learned about something called as threads. We have learned something called as thread based multitasking, process based multitasking, what are the different states that thread is in, what is a thread, right? And then we ended with a topic called as thread priorities. Today we're going to continue with few more topics, guys. We're going to learn the most important topic, that is how to create threads in Java. So I will see you right on the other side, guys. Alright, we are back with another interesting and exciting topic, guys, on how to create a thread. Very important, very simple but very important concept, right? So remember in the previous C language and C++ languages, we never came across something called as a thread concept, or basically we never wrote programs where multiple threads will run on the multiple cores of a processor, which is not possible in the previous two languages, right? So Java came up to take the advantage of this hardware, right, to make sure that your performance of the program is faster, right? So the execution time reduces. So these are the one of the two big advantages of having a thread concept, right, and writing a program using threads. So we'll see there are mainly two ways in Java. Two ways we can create threads, guys. The first way is we can we can create a thread using a runnable interface, guys. Okay, we have an interface called as a runnable interface. Now remember, we have already looked at something called as interfaces. I hope you remember, whenever you want to create an interface, you have to write the keyword called interface and the name of the interface, and within your interface you can only declare abstract methods. If you remember, if you have not seen that, please go to my previous video, it is there. It will talk about what are interfaces, guys. So if you are not sure, please go back and watch that video. So whenever you want to create a thread, the first type is you can implement a runnable class, or sorry, not a runnable interface, right? So your interfaces will contain only abstract methods. They do not contain something called as concrete methods, right? So we will see how to create using runnable interface. The second way is by extending a class called as a thread class. Okay, there is an inbuilt class in your Java called as thread, right? Whichever class wants to use or wants to create a thread, then that class has to extend a class called thread. Okay, I hope you remember, extends keywords is used for classes. Implements keyword is used for interfaces. Whenever you want to inherit properties, whenever a class wants to inherit properties from the parent class, then you use the keyword extends. That is, child class extends parent class. Or a class can implement an interface. So in that case, what you will do? You will write class implements an interface, right? So this is how you can write interfaces and extend classes. So these are the two ways. One is you can implement runnable interface, or you can extend a thread class. Two ways of creating threads in Java. So first we are going to look at how to create a thread using implementing a runnable interface. Okay, so you can see there, whenever you want to create a runnable interface, or whenever you want to create a thread using runnable interface, in that case, remember, whatever thread you want to create, whatever execution whatever you want to execute, whatever content you want to execute in that thread, it has to be written in that run function. Remember, always whatever has to run on the processor in the thread, okay, that has to be written within your run function. Okay, same applies in the thread class, we will see a little later. But even for whenever you are implementing a runnable interface, make sure whichever class implements a runnable interface, that class should have a function called as a run function, because in your interface called runnable interface, there is an abstract function called run that has been declared. That function has to be overridden in the class which is implementing that runnable interface. Remember, if the class has been only declared in that interface called runnable, that if the function has been only declared in the runnable interface, that function has to be defined in the class which is implementing that runnable interface. That is why, remember, whenever you want to create a thread within your runnable interfaces, make sure that that class contains a run function. Okay, that run function is basically your thread or a lightweight subprocess, right? So that is how you have to create using a run function. After you create a run function, now remember, whenever you want to call that run function, you have to first create an object for that particular class which is implementing the runnable interface. I will show you with an example, do not worry. I will show you the example, but just listen carefully for now. Whenever a class implements a runnable interface, that class we have to create an object, and that object has to be passed in the parameter of the thread class, thread constructor class, okay, or thread constructor, right? You can see there in that thread constructor there are two parameters you can give. One is the first part of your parameter, first parameter of your thread constructor is the object of the class which implements the runnable interface. The second parameter is the name of the thread itself. You can name your threads also, right? So this is how you have to do it. First, whenever you want to create a thread in your runnable in your class which implements runnable interface, that class should have a run function. In that you should define what that thread is doing. Okay, whenever you want to start running that thread, then first you have to create the object for that class which implements runnable interface. That object should be passed as a parameter to that thread constructor. Okay, the first parameter is your object of that class. Okay, object of the class which is implementing the runnable interface, and the second parameter is the name of the thread, right? So these are the two steps you should follow whenever you want to create a thread using a runnable interface. I will show you the example a little later, but one last point there you can see there. Remember, once the object of that thread class has been created, first you have to create the object of the class which implements the runnable interface. Next you have to create the object of the class thread class itself. That object you have to use and you have to call a function called start. Okay, using that object dot, I have to call the function called start. That start implicitly will call the run function which you have defined. Okay, so that is how your execution of your threads will run whenever you use something called as implementing runnable interface. Next, we will look at something called as creating threads using by extending a thread class. Then we will see the programs or examples on that, guys. Alright, this is the second way of creating your thread, guys. The first way we have already seen, by extending a by implementing a runnable interface you can create a thread. Another way of creating a thread is by extending a class called a thread class. Okay, this is very simple, similar to the previous one, but remember I will tell you what the difference is. Now the second way of creating a thread is, remember, a class can extend a class, another class called as thread. Okay, a class extends a thread. This is another way of creating a thread within your Java. A class can extend a thread class, and in that class you have to define what the run function is going to do, right? So this is another way of doing it. Now in this case, it is the run function is same as the previous one what we have talked about in the runnable interface. In this also you have to create the run function, but the difference here is you have to only create the object of the class, okay, which is extending the thread class. You do not have to create two objects. For a runnable interface, we have to create an object for the class which implements the runnable interface. Then that object has to be passed to the thread constructor. Then the thread object has to be used to call the start function. So there are 2 to 3 steps involved in creating a thread when you talk about implementing runnable interface. But when you talk about creating a thread using by extending a thread class, there are only 2 steps involved. The first step is basically you have to just create the function called run, in which you have to define what the thread is doing. Okay, and once it is done, what you can do is you can extend a thread. That means you can create a object for a thread class. As soon as you create the object for that particular thread class, then you can directly use that object dot the start function. The start function implicitly will call the run function which has already been written. So only 2 steps are involved here. In the previous one, there were about 3 steps that were involved. So make sure you know the difference, guys, right? So we will see the program now with an example. Alright, so you can see the Eclipse IDE in front of you. I will show you first how to create a thread by implementing a runnable interface, and then we will look at how to create a thread by extending a thread class. So you can see here, initially in this program, I have created a package. Remember, I have already told you in my previous videos, you can see that I have created a video on how to create packages. The first line in your program is nothing but your package you have to declare. That means under which folder your program is going to be stored, right? So in this case, I have created a hierarchical package. That means I have created a package called testing. Inside that, I have created another package called threads, within which I am storing this particular program or this class, right? So this is you have to define where your program is being stored. This is the first line. Then next I have created a class called thread2. Okay, the name of my class is thread2, and remember, whichever class contains my main function, that class name should be my file name. Don't forget that. So for this class called thread2, it implements a runnable interface. Okay, that means I told you there are 3 steps involved. You have to write first a run function. This run function is nothing but a thread, okay, a lightweight sub process which will be executed. So whatever you define in your run function will get executed as a thread on the processor. Okay, so I have written here as a run function. It will then I have written a println statement which will basically print thread is running. Next, we have a function, another function called as a main function. Now this main function normally is referred to as main thread. It is not referred to as a sub process or a sub thread. It is a main thread which will in turn call these sub threads. Okay, so this is your main function which we have already seen in so many different programs. Within which we have created an object. Now there are 3 steps involved here. First, we have to create the object of the class which is implementing the runnable interface. So remember, thread2 is the class which is implementing runnable interface. For that class, I am creating an object called m1. Okay. Next, in the second step, I have to create an object for this thread class now. Okay, there is a class called as thread class for which I have to create an object, and for this thread class, I have to pass the parameter of parameter contains the first parameter basically contains the object of this class which is implementing the runnable interface. Okay, so this is the parameter you have to pass for the thread class. So this is the first step, that is creating an object for the class which implements runnable interface. Second step, for thread class you have to create an object, and for this constructor you have to pass the object of this class. Okay, and finally if you want to start executing the thread, you have to use this thread class object called t1 and call the function called as start. The start function implicitly will call this run function. Okay, so remember, when you are executing this program, initially it will go into the main function, it will execute the first line, it will create the object called m1, next it will go to the second line, create the object called t1. For this thread, this parameter has been passed, and this t1 object of this thread class will call a start function which implicitly will call this run function. Normally, previously we would have seen whichever function you want to call, you have to write that function name here. So normally previous programs you have seen, not the thread concept, but normal Java programs, you would write the object name dot the function name. So for example, this was, if imagine this was a normal function, then I would normally write t1 dot run instead of start. But when you talk about thread class, remember the start function is always used to invoke the run function. You should not write here as t1 dot run. You have to write t1 dot start, which implicitly will invoke or call this function called run, and it will start that subthread. Okay, and it will execute this particular program, and it will just print thread is running. So I'll just show you the output for this. Basically, this program will just execute, and it will show that thread is running, guys. All right, just 1 second. It is a little slow. My computer is a little slow, so just hang on. Yeah. So you can see on the bottom here, we can see that it has printed thread is running on your left hand side here, right? So basically it executes the main function first. It will execute all these 3 statements. This third statement will in turn invoke this run function, and it will basically execute this line which is being printed here, right? So next we will move on to another program which is nothing but creating a thread using something called as a thread class or extending a thread class. So you can see here, this is much more simpler whenever a thread extends a thread class. Say, similar to the previous program, I have created a package called testing, within which there is another package called threads, within which this program or class is going to be stored. Okay, in this case, I created a class called as thread1. This thread1 class is extending or extends a thread class. It is not implementing the runnable interface as the previous program. You are extending a thread class. Okay, that is the main difference. And same thing as the previous program, we have to create the run function. We have to define the run function, because this run function is the function basically is nothing but your thread which gets executed, right? So in this case again it will be printed thread is running when this function run is called. Next, in this main function there are only two steps involved here. First, we have created for this thread1 class, which is extending thread class. For this I have created an object called T1. Only this one step is required, and using this T1 directly I can just call my start function, which implicitly invokes or calls this run function. I do not have to create two different objects here, because remember this class is not implementing a runnable interface, it is directly extending the thread class. So for that reason, this thread1 class I can just create an object. I don't have to pass any parameters, and using this object directly I can call the start function, which will implicitly invoke the run function. As the previous program, same exact output you will get for this program also. As you can see on the left hand side bottom, you can see it is printing thread is running. So initially it will go into this main function, execute these two lines. The second line will basically invoke this run function implicitly, and it will execute this line and it will print thread is running. Okay guys, thank you for watching my video. I hope you have liked, you have understood this. If you have any questions, please ping me. Please like the video, share the video to as many people as you can, and get back to me anytime whenever you have any questions. Thank you. I will definitely share all the programs and the PPTs that I've used in this video also right down in the description, guys. Thank you for watching. See you in another video. Bye-bye.